Good morning, everyone. Oh, okay, good morning, everyone. We're just 1 minute away from our official start time. And so we will get started quite quickly. I want to thank you for joining us today for this session on water insecurity drivers of intra and inter-household conflict. Um, I'm Katrina Charles. I'm a professor at the University of Oxford in the UK. And this session is a chance for us to share some of the work we've been doing in this area and to have to discuss this with our panelists. And so one particular area of conflict that we've been interested in our work is looking within the household. Focusing, and so across this session, we will end up focusing quite a lot on the gender issues in particular, around how decision making happens and some of the aspects that do lead to conflict on that. In our work in the sector, we do often make assumptions to simplify it, of course. And one particular set of assumptions we make is around the household. So we assume the household is a decision-making unit rather than the individuals. We assume that women are the water managers and make decisions about water. And therefore, they're the ones we should educate for a lot of issues around water quality. We assume that we can, and so with these two assumptions, we are not understanding the full situation. In most households, in your own household, I'm sure you're familiar that different people have different preferences. So, for example, if you think about making a purchase of even something as simple as fruit and vegetables, one person might have a preference based on taste for where you buy that and what you buy, and one might have a preference based on cost. So, whose preference wins out? We know that this can be an area of conflict. At the very extreme end, you might have violence, but there's lots of other types of conflict as part of that decision making as well, and those seeing how those preferences are met. So it becomes really important to determine when we're looking at water security interventions, who are we talking to as the decision maker? Who is making that decision? How are they making that decision? There's a lot of work about why households choose to take up water security improvements or more climate resilient options. But this work often focuses, as I said, at the household. There has been very limited research in the sector on these intra-household dynamics about who's making this decision. So the work we're sharing today came about because of some previous work we were doing on qualitative studies, that despite managing health and water for the household, so women often have a role in very much managing the water, they're not necessarily the ones choosing which water source to use. So when water quality is defined by which water source you choose, that ends up being the man's decision if it's a financial decision. And so we've done a large study across the REACH program. And so we're going to present some early results from that today in a presentation first, and that's drawing on two pieces of work. One is ReachWiser, called ReachWiser, and one is called CIAT. My colleagues will explain that as we go through their presentations. This cuts across different countries, different contexts, including different urbanicities, so going from urban to peri-urban to rural. And it captures both wash and water resources and agriculture side. So as you'll see in a moment, we have a panel that captures all of these. And it's a mixed methods social science piece of research where we've talked to both male and female decision makers in the household. And in case of CIAT, also other adults in the household to understand why these decisions are being made. So first, we're going to have some short research snippets from our team on these early results from the study. Second, we're going to have a panel discussion. So I'm really pleased to have our panelists here with us. I will introduce them more formally after the presentations, but just to highlight that they are coming from different backgrounds, from gender, from agriculture, from WASH, so that we're getting a range of perspectives in our panel. But firstly, I want to go to our presenters. So we have 5 presenters today from across our international teams. So Professor Salome Bukachi from University of Nairobi will start us off with a talk on methods. Dr. Sonia Hoke from University of Oxford will share some work we've done on subjective and objective water insecurity experiences. We've got Dr. Mari Hillersland from Oxford who will share the CIAT work focusing on using economic methods to understand how that intra-household decision-making is occurring, and also thinking about land tenure and water tenure and how these link in. We'll have Dr. Sarah Dickon share her work on the Empowerment Index. And then finally, Dr. Saskia Nowitzki will share some work, particularly looking at the qualitative side on water quality and how access to safe water is linked to these gender issues and the intra-household decision-making. So thanks very much. We will start the video now, and do put questions in the chat. We have our presenters here online, so they will answer questions in the chat as we go along. Thanks.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Salome Bukachi, a professor in the University of Nairobi, and I'll be taking us through an overview of the methods of the CIAT and WISA research studies. Several years of international interdisciplinary collaboration led us to engage in 2 studies based on similar design approaches. The first study was the REACH-WISA study, which is a cross-comparative study, and the CIAT study, which focuses in depth on rural Kenya. So to understand the intra and inter-household and individual perspectives in water security dynamics and decision-making, we used a cross-comparative study design across countries, across cultures, across geographies, and across urban cities. So for the countries, 3 research sites were identified from existing rich water security observatories. This is the Coastal Water Security Area, Khulna district in Bangladesh, Sustaining Growth Through Water Security, Dukem, Ethiopia, Small Towns in Fragile Environments, Lodwar, Kenya. This cross-comparative study was necessary because while there are similarities in gender, culture and geography plays a huge role, and so the need to understand under which conditions these conclusions are relevant across the countries, geography, and culture. The other aspect we looked at was urbanicity, and this is as a result of the rapid changes that are underway in our cities. There is need to capture these different types of settlements and livelihoods, and to capture the dynamics within the water space across these urban cities. Other points in the design were also temporality, and with the recognition that water security experiences are dynamic and that climate is a key driver. We undertook multiple visits by season to just see how seasonality plays out in relation to the water resilience aspects, water inequalities, and water insecurity aspects in these study areas. The other factor that we looked at that cut across this cross-comparative aspect was the gender aspect. Using the feminist approach, we sought to understand the intra-household dynamics based on qualitative previous work. So what are the methods that these studies used to be able to get information and data? We looked at water infrastructure audit, which was undertaken in all the study sites to identify water sources that are used and management of how they are managed. We looked at community engagement approaches. We used community engagement approaches for context building, and this helped in empowering and working with community leaders to understand their communities. We also used the household and intra-household surveys based on economic survey design approaches. The surveys consisted of 2 parts. One is the household questionnaire, which was administered to individuals making the decision about the household water, and the most informed of the household's water choices. And we also undertook individual questionnaires, which included decision-making questions on who makes decisions about regular water expenditures. Semi-structured interviews were also carried out, covering a range of topics with men and women. Finally, we had stakeholder interviews on relevant topics, ranging from environmental management to approaches to managing water, to considering disability in WASH, with the aim to connect household experiences to policy environment. So the CIAT study was carried out in Kilifi County. This was an in-depth study that looked at an area which is in the coastal region of Kenya, and it focused on gendered aspects using similar mixed methods like the Rich Weiser study. And this was based on a survey of similar design by Maria Hillesland. Both studies were carried out by research teams consisting of both junior and senior researchers, research assistants from the respective countries and communities who are recruited and trained extensively. Technical backstopping was provided throughout the study through regular meetings and collaborative engagements. The Rich Weiser was able to reach an approximately average of 550 households with 2 people in each household, plus 51 interviews per country, while CIAT reached 1,347 households with multiple individuals. And all this was to help understand seasonal variations in water security inequalities, and their connections to climate resilience, results of which my colleagues will expound on. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Sonia Huff. I will present snippets of our findings from the Weiser study to show changes in household water insecurity across seasons. And I'm going to compare this with objective measures such as access to infrastructure, distance, and so on. I will draw on our survey data from Bangladesh, where we worked in Khulna district on the southwestern coastal area of the country. This area has high level of groundwater salinity. And in Kenya, we worked in Turkana County, which is inarguably one of the driest places on the planet. To measure household subjective experiences of water security, we used the 12-item HY scale, in which the questions focused on the 4 weeks prior to the survey. As we can see from this jitter plot, where a higher HY score indicates greater water insecurity, we see that these seasonal changes are more pronounced in rural areas where people use seasonally available rainwater or surface water sources. But in this case, in peri-urban areas where households have access to deep tube wells throughout the year, these seasonal changes are less pronounced. But yet we can see that in some areas, for example, this particular chunk in rural Bangladesh, household water security does not improve in the wet season compared to others. And let's see why. When we look at the sources of water used by households across these 3 seasons in this rural study site in Bangladesh, we see that most households in the southern part shifted to rainwater during the wet season, while these households in the northern part continued to use shallow tube wells, which are off premises and likely to have higher salinity. And upon further investigation, we found that the households in the southern part had higher storage capacity because of years of NGO and government intervention after Cyclone Isla and Cyclone Sidr, which happened about 15 years ago. And it is this difference in storage capacity that partially explains the differences in reported household water insecurities. Now let's move on to Kenya. Here, households in Lodwar town have piped water connections, but the supply is highly unreliable, and many have to supplement with water purchased from public kiosks or hand pumps. As we move further north, outside the utility service area, households either have to use vended water fetched from the utilities boreholes or on the Kawalase River. Kawalase River is a seasonal river, and here we can see children scooping out water from the dry river beds. Households reported that after the first rains, the river water is likely to be contaminated with fecal waste because of the open defecation practiced in this area. As we move further north towards Lokaparpare, households are now farther away from the river, and they often have to depend on these private tanks where water is more costly. As expected, households reported high water insecurities in both seasons. But if we look carefully, we can see that the median scores, as marked by these box plots, have actually decreased in the dry season, which is quite unexpected, because in the dry season, you're supposed to be more water insecure. So you're supposed to have higher scores, not lower. So we plotted the same data on a map, and we can see that some households in Kawalase as well as Lokaparpare reported lower scores, that is, lower water insecurities in the dry season. When we look at the water sources used by households over the past 4 weeks, we can see that the decrease in scores can partially be explained by the fact that households in Lokaparpare shifted to vended water because of installation of new water tanks in this area. And although technically it was the dry season, there was a bit of rainfall in the weeks prior to the survey. And so some households in Kawalase, in fact, could now get water from the river instead of going to the town to fetch water. The point I'm trying to make here is that just because a household is using an unimproved source or a more costly source doesn't mean that they will be more water insecure. In fact, they can feel more water secured because the water source is now close to their homes. And lastly, these are the charts from Bangladesh and Kenya. What we see is that some households in rural Bangladesh reported very high water insecurities in the dry season. And many households in Kenya reported similar scores across all seasons. But although their scores are same, their water context is highly different. For example, households in this particular box had to walk up to 1 kilometer and with a waiting time of 15 minutes to fetch water from a public tube well. In comparison, these households had to wake up early in the morning, walk around 4 kilometers, and spend hours digging a dry riverbed to fetch 1 or 2 jerry cans of water. So this highlights the very subjective natures of water insecurity, and the HY scale, we found it to be useful for seasonal comparisons within a given context, but relatively less useful when comparing across different contexts.
My name is Maria Hillisland, and my work is largely focused in Cliffy County, Kenya, on land and water, the land and water nexus, social relations, and inter-household dynamics. So Cliffy County, Kenya is an area that lacks water infrastructure and access to basic water services. The data was collected at a time of severe water shortage in the area. Households made approximately 42 trips a week on average. These trips are typically made by women, sometimes with children, on foot. The qualitative data, although, suggests that men are also becoming more engaged as water becomes scarcer. According to the Kenya Constitution, everyone has the right to safe and clean drinking water, but there's different factors that are coming into play. So one is that land tenure shapes how water is accessed. Since many of the water points are tied to the land, this shapes women's water rights and access in a different way than it shapes men's. And the second is that inter-household dynamics also influence choices in household water outcomes, including water sources for drinking. So household land tends to be held by men, and landholders with water sources tend to be among the few who hold multiple rights to the water source, which makes their claim to water stronger than others. So this is access rights, right to manage and transform the water point they can exclude, and right to transfer to others. Women's rights then to water in the household's own land is really going to depend on her relationship to the landholder. On the other side, women report slightly greater access rights to water on others' household land than men. And this is particularly the case when water is scarce. And the qual data suggests that women have certain informal mechanisms that men seem to be removed from for accessing water from other women. And the qual suggests that water may be exchanged not just for a fee, but also for other goods, such as firewood and poultry, or it could be borrowed with the expectation that the water is repaid. And continued access to the water then is going to require that the rules are followed. When they're not followed, there can be inter-household conflict. And it suggests that there's this complicated process of negotiation that needs to be re-articulated each time. And so the duration of rights, or the rights to these different water points, really depend on the ongoing relationships. So in Kenya, land tenure systems can be broadly characterized as state land, common land, and private land. So state land is owned by the state government on behalf of the public. Common land is held by county councils on behalf of the people. This can be land that's held and managed collectively. There's also, however, land that's been allocated through the county councils for agricultural productions to households. And this is then held privately by households under customary law. It's typically held by men and then passed down through the generations on the male side. There's also private land that's owned by individuals under freehold titles, but most rural land is held by households under customary law. In our study, very few of the water points, things less than 5% of the listed by the households, are on state land. About a quarter of the water points listed by households are community water points on common land held by county councils. So this is water that's free. It's typically sourced from surface water, so it tends to be water dams that require some labor input from the households that use it in the community. But the water is typically not considered safe drinking water. Most of the water points are on household land. These are water sources that are on their own land or their neighbors' plots, or even plots that are further away and households further away. The majority of private water points on household land are taps, and others are small wells or dams. Individuals within the community can obtain water from these by negotiating with a family member of the landholder and paying a fee. Often women manage these transactions. There's also communal water pans and shallow wells that typically require labor input and shared with neighbors and families and friends. So relationships within the household, as well as dynamics within the household, also matter in terms of household water outcomes. The qualitative data suggests that income and control over how income is spent on water expenditures really goes hand in hand with the water source choice for drinking water. The safer water sources tend to be from groundwater, and these are from taps on others' household land, often require a fee. Men are more likely to control water expenditures than women, even when women are managing the water for the household. In households, however, where women water managers do have exclusive decision-making over regular water expenditures, so they have more power over how to spend the money, these households are less likely to choose surface water, so unimproved water sources for drinking, and more likely to choose safer options, so choose groundwater sources on a given water trip. Because when they have more control, more power over regular water expenditures and how they're spent, women are better able to negotiate, right, with other women who manage the taps on the other households, rather than having to go to the community water dams or common land for drinking water. So in the absence of state infrastructure, water insecurity can be particularly severe in rural areas, as is the case in Cliffy County. Often when implementing projects, the focus can be on the community as a whole or the household as a unit, or the focus may be on different needs of men and women, separate groups. But there really needs to be more attention paid to interrelationships and negotiations and different power dynamics, both inside and outside the household, and how these impact water access and outcomes.
Hello to those of you listening today. My name is Sarah Dickin, and I'm a lecturer at Uppsala University. Today, I want to talk to you about some of our work within the Reach Wiser initiative to measure empowerment in a water security context. We developed a tool, the Empowerment in WASH Index tool, as part of some earlier work in the REACH program. And this was actually the first tool developed to measure empowerment in a water security context, drawing on multidimensional indicators, looking at agency and control over WASH resources from individual, household, and community levels. The tool uses a series of 12 indicators that draw on data from male and female pairs of respondents within a household. I'm not going to go into the methodological details today, but there is some more information at the end. Today, I want to present some of our work applying this tool in the ReachWiser sites. So the first finding I want to share is that empowerment does vary greatly between different cultural contexts and geographies. We can see that empowerment scores were higher overall in Bangladesh, followed by Kenya and Ethiopia, although for Ethiopia, we only had rural communities included. There is also a trend that we see that women report lower levels of empowerment compared to men in all 3 sites. There are also some variations between rural, peri-urban, and urban contexts. And we see that empowerment increases in the Kenyan site from rural to urban. We see for Bangladesh, for example, that actually empowerment for women was lowest in peri-urban sites and highest in urban areas. If we disaggregate this overall measure of empowerment into the respective indicators, we can see which factors are contributing most to disempowerment. And this is important because it's also where we can think about targeting future actions to increase empowerment. I'll just give you some examples here. On the left, we have women, and on the right, we have men. And if we look at the very bottom, we see that for Bangladesh, that individual WASH gender attitudes are actually contributing the most disempowerment. So the larger the bar, the greater its contribution to disempowerment. And this is much larger than for the other 2 sites. In contrast, we see, for example, water collection time. For the Kenyan site, this is contributing more for women than for the other sites. We can also see that some of these indicators like decision-making, input into expenditures, for example, is important across all 3 sites, as Maria highlighted in the previous presentation. What are the connections between empowerment and water security? We found some really interesting findings. We found significant associations between respondents who are empowered and different measures of water security. So empowered individuals were more likely to have at least one reliable water source and pay for their water source in Bangladesh, which may imply they use a better quality source. They are more likely to pay for a water supply and have improved sanitation in Kenya. And they're more likely to have access to at least one improved drinking water source in Ethiopia, which is important because around only a third of respondents reported using an improved source. We can also see some connections to the IWISE scores, but you can also see that it does vary greatly between the different sites and the different empowerment sub-indicators. So just for example, we see that for Bangladesh, gender attitudes at the individual level were positively linked to water security. So having more positive gender attitudes was linked to higher water security for rural and peri-urban areas only. We see for rural Kenya, though, some other indicators were linked to water security, and these included having more input into WASH expenditures in the household and also being able to speak up in community processes to improve water supply. I want to end with some implications of these research findings. So first of all, there's a clear need to address inter-household gender inequalities and gender relations, which have not been a major focus of WASH interventions so far. And this can be done through activities to increase recognition of the work that goes into securing water supplies for the household, as well as redistributing some of this work amongst household members, including men. Secondly, we can see that disempowerment varies cross-culturally across the different sites. So this requires localized assessment of empowerment to target activities more effectively. And finally, people who are more empowered often use better quality services from what we can see. So this suggests that improving women's ability to make important and strategic decisions increasing their control over wash resources could play a really important role in achieving the SDG 6 targets. You can see here that we have some of our resources available for you to use if you would like to measure empowerment in your own work. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to be building on what the others have said and share more of our findings on water safety perceptions and practices. So to quickly take stock of the starting point for this work, recent estimates find more than 4.4 billion people don't have access to safe drinking water. And to improve access to safe water is going to require water users to choose to practice safe water measures and to use professionalized or otherwise improved water services. From decades of research, we expect that socioeconomic characteristics, including gender, are going to influence the psychology of household safe water practices and this choice making. So to give a bit more information on what I mean by that, we can start by thinking, of course, health threat perception is important. People need to know about a threat to see a need to protect themselves from it. And we know that threat perception is moderated by gender. So research on many different hazards finds gender relates to threat interpretation and levels of concern. But it's not all about threat perception. Behavior is also driven by whether people believe there are effective solutions to control a hazard, and if they believe they're personally capable of implementing those solutions. So if we think that we can protect ourselves from a hazard, we're likely to develop a problem-focused orientation towards it where we're going to take protective actions. But if we don't think that that is feasible, then considering threats brings a sense of helplessness, which is difficult to tolerate psychologically. And our natural psychological response is to develop a defensive orientation where we would reframe or otherwise find ways to disregard or make ourselves feel better about threatening circumstances. So this background formed the basis of our efforts in WISER to understand what determines whether a problem-focused or defensive orientation towards water safety is more prominent. We found that gender, urbanicity, marital status, and age all interact to influence participants' orientations. Women were generally more defensive, especially in rural areas where gendered expectations of housework were more rigid. Men became more defensive as urbanicity increased, and we think that this is related to there being more options to pay for water as urbanicity increased. Single mothers and elderly were more oriented at the extremes, so either very problem-focused or very defensive, with the main differentiation being whether they had support from family or the wider community or not. So a key finding is the importance of recognizing that households are navigating complex threatscapes, meaning they're navigating many hazards simultaneously with high stakes trade-offs. Within this, women more often highlighted challenges of allocating their time and energy, and men were more often highlighting finance-related allocation challenges. So we also found that there is not a lot of intra-household discussion or knowledge sharing about water safety. This was reported directly by participants, but also reflected in findings that men and women in the same household had different perceptions of water quality, different understanding of what is within the scope of water quality, and different responses to what practices and choices are happening around water safety in their household. So some of the takeaways from this, firstly, the findings support prioritizing service delivery over product delivery, which I think is a good thing, as it seems to be that this is the direction the sector is moving in for many good reasons. The findings dissuade interventions that focus only on improving or providing information and not on addressing difficult trade-offs. These kind of interventions can heighten threat awareness, but if they're only adding to women's burden, they're unlikely to create improvement in water safety and instead can just lead to more defensiveness around water safety. So the findings encourage providing information to multiple household members, both men and women, and that links back to the viability of professionalized service provision models and to what Maria was sharing about differences in men and women's decision-making. Essentially, we need interventions that make it more feasible to choose safer options, not just stressing people by emphasizing the importance of safer options. And a main takeaway from this work then is that empowerment, not fear of a health threat, is the primary determinant of safe water practices. So to speak to what Sarah was sharing, this is specifically empowerment that serves to enhance people's self-efficacy with respect to safe water practices and choosing safer sources. And so a key question then is, how do we create and strengthen opportunity structures that make choosing safe water more feasible for people? And from the WISER study, we have a richness of findings to build examples of how information and interventions might be designed or tailored for this purpose. But that's it from me, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the panel. Thank you for your attention.
Right, thank you very much, everyone. We know that was a lot of information for what's very early in the morning for many of us. And so I want just to summarize that for you briefly. So firstly, thanks very much to our presenters as well for all sharing all that amazing work. I think a couple of the key things I'd like you to take away from that. Firstly, the challenges of measuring water security, when and for whom. We know climate has a big implication, so it's really important when we consider when are we measuring water security and how do we represent that. There's a second point, there's this really strong relationship between water and empowerment and interrelations between men and women. So it's important to understand who is making that decision, because women as water managers aren't always controlling the finances for water as well. And then who has access to information, because men and women aren't necessarily talking within a household and sharing the information that we think they are. And lastly, to echo Saskia's point, we can't add to burdens if we want success. And I think, as we're well aware within our own teams, that's as much for our own teams as it is for the communities where we work. There's a limit to how much we can do, and we need to be really careful about how we're thinking about that. So with these findings, we all know that this is a very complex idea and it's very hard to do. And this has come up in the chat already. And so we will come across the discussions to what are the key takeaways from this? How can we operationalize this in our research? What can we do differently? So I want to discuss these findings with our panelists. And as I've said, the panelists come from across policy and practice from different sectors and can help us to understand how we can bring this into our work, how we can use this and learn from all the other programs, or many other programs that are going on around the world to address these similar issues. So first, let me introduce our panelists, and please do switch your cameras on as I'm talking. So firstly, Kika Goyal is a regional advisor for WASH Climate and Environment at UNICEF East and Southern Africa region. He's worked with UNICEF for over a decade and has over 25 years of extensive experience in planning, implementation, and monitoring WASH, environment, and climate resilient programs in humanitarian and in development contexts. Next, we have Jenny Grunwald from CIDA. She's a program specialist with the Swedish Development Corporation Agency, CIDA, with a particular interest in adaptation, climate resilient WASH, and the human development and peace nexus. She has a background as an interdisciplinary social scientist with in-depth experience of work in India and sub-Saharan Africa, especially Ethiopia, and that's on groundwater governance, water self-supply, human rights, and sustainable textiles. Next, we have Jess MacArthur from the Institute for Sustainable Futures at UTS in Sydney. Jess has completed her PhD at UTS on innovating ways to explore how women are impacted by water and sanitation programming in South and Southeast Asia. And Jess specializes in the use of design thinking to impact program strategy and market systems. She's also a research and learning advisor at Save the Children. And our fourth panelist today is Vanya Slavcheska from the Food and Agriculture Organization, where she's a social policy officer in the Rural Transformation and Gender Equality Division. She's a gender and development economist with over 10 years experience and one of the lead authors of FAO's 2023 report on the status of women in agri-food systems. And we will share links in the chat later on to some of the references that the panelists are making, or talking about. So Vanya, before FAO, Vanya was working as a gender and social inclusion scientist in the crops for nutrition and health lever of the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT, based in Hanoi in Vietnam and Cali in Colombia. So thank you very much to all our panelists for joining this morning. It's really great to have you here. And so what I want to use this panel as an opportunity to, as been highlighted already in the chat, is to look at, so what do we do with this information? I think we've been working on gender for so long in the sector, across water for agriculture, water for productivity, WASH sectors. So what can we do? And I think, but first I want to turn to Vanya, and because you've been one of the lead authors, as I said, for this FAO report on the status of women in agri-food systems. So you reviewed the evidence on what is working in terms of addressing these global gaps we're seeing in the water and agriculture sector and looking internationally. So where we've focused in a few countries, you've looked at the whole thing. Can you share some of your key findings on what have been some successful policy responses, and especially thinking about how to shift these gender norms and improve women's empowerment?
Thank you, Katrina, very much for the introduction, and to the panelists, to the presenters for the insightful studies. So, as the presentation highlighted, and also we highlighted in the status of women in agri-food systems report, gender gaps in agriculture, in food security and water security, and generally in the agri-food system are persistent, and there has been limited progress in closing some of these gaps in the last decade, but progress is achievable. It requires, however, a change of how we treat gender issues in agriculture, in water projects, and in rural development more broadly. It requires also moving beyond gender-blind and gender-light solutions and treating gender equality and empowerment as a fundamental objective in programs and policy. This is good for women's welfare, it is important, but it has wide-ranging benefits across the agri-food system, including for water security. So we reviewed a lot of evidence for the report on what works to improve gender equality and women's empowerment. And we identified a range of successful interventions and approaches that can be bundled or integrated in other programs. I'll just give a couple of examples. For example, closing gaps in assets and resources can help strengthen women's bargaining power. Particularly important is improving women's land tenure, which has been, there is plenty of evidence that has shown that to improve women's bargaining, but that it leads to improvement in women's bargaining power. It also improves their employment, investment opportunities, their access to services, resilience, and including gender-based violence outcomes. But it has also wide-ranging impacts, including on the better management of natural resources. Another example that works is strengthening women's networks and organization. It can bolster women's collective agency while also disseminating critical information, building capacity, and reaching a significant number of women. And one other example that I wanted to highlight that can be integrated successfully in programs, and that many of the presentations also touched on, is addressing women's great unpaid work and care burden. Addressing women's unpaid care burden through redistributing through transformative approaches, and I'll come back to that later, or through providing childcare and better infrastructure, has a large positive impact on women's empowerment and returns and on their welfare, but it just enables women to better participate in agri-food system. A common thread among successful interventions is that they're intentional about addressing gender inequality, and this is reflected in their design, as well as in the resources they allocate to gender interventions. And another thing that is emerging very prominently in the review of the evidence is that interventions must be transformative, and they need to tackle the root causes that drive gender gaps in all levels, at the household, at community, at national. At national, this implies tackling, addressing inadequate institution and policy framework that discriminate against women. And at the local level, this also means tackling discriminatory social norms. So what we found in the report is that discriminatory social norms and rules that affect women and girls are often at the heart of gender inequality, but they're very slow to change. Just to give you an example of discriminatory rules, although we've spoken a lot, is that in the majority of countries globally, people believe that young children suffer when mothers work. But gender norms also relegate the majority of unpaid care work and domestic work, including water collection, to women. And this has wide-ranging implications, as we already heard from the presenters. What we are finding is that gender transformative approaches are very effective in changing discriminatory norms, at least at the local level, and they can be cost effective. Gender transformative approaches include engaging authorities, engaging with men and boys to strengthen women's access to resources and bargaining power. Another example is the gender action learning systems. And in Zambia, for example, it led to increase in the number of women taking leadership role positions and the number of women speaking in public and being consulted in community leaders. So just to conclude, the evidence on the effectiveness of gender transformative approaches is growing, but more research is, of course, needed, particularly from rigorous quantitative evaluation. And more research is needed on how to take this at scale. But they've been successfully integrated in a wide range of rural development projects.
Okay, thanks very much, Vanya. I think there's so much work that's been done, and I have done a link to the report in the chat as well, so people can read more, because there's so much rich work in that. But I think particularly if you look at the wash sector, we've been doing this work for quite a while. So Jess, I want to turn to you, because you've done work that's kind of looking back at the history in the wash sector. So this isn't the first time we've tried gender responsive work. It's not a new concept. For the wash sector, what's been successful in this area, and what are the challenges that you think we're still facing?
Yeah, thanks so much. And Vanya, just to echo what you've said, I'm really looking forward to reading that report. It's fantastic stuff that you shared. Before the Sustainable Development Goals, before the Millennium Development Goals, we had the international decades. And there was a really interesting overlap between the International Decade for Women and the International Decade for Water and Sanitation in the early 80s. And many of us don't even know about this, but there's a really big surge of work in the early 80s, before me, I have to admit, that's a big surge of work that helped us to think about research and learning around the connections between gender and WASH, or women in WASH. An example of this is a fantastic lit review that was published in 1985 that looked at 775 program documents done by IRC in Delft. And what you could relabel almost 90% of what's in that document as 2024, and no one would blink, because we really, unfortunately, haven't progressed that much. And looking in the chat, Sean, you were talking about much of kind of the emphasis and the push on water and sanitation programming more globally has been from spaces of, and for good reason, public health, engineering, and economics. And those three sectors have evolved a lot, actually, but not necessarily together as we connect in this WASH space. So while other sectors like health, ag, education, microfinance, they seem to have moved the needle a little bit and done it a little bit better than WASH. For some reason in WASH, we have kind of been stuck on participation, which is an incredibly important indicator. I call it the butts in seats indicator. Sorry to be a bit crude, but basically, are there people at the table, but we don't actually check to see, are they speaking? Is their voice being listened to? Are they involved in decision making? And when women are responsible in the home for WASH more broadly, but the decisions are being made not by women, there's a disconnect. And I think that's been highlighted in this research. So current literature practice is really focusing either on women only. We forget men. Actually, unfortunately, we bring women to the table and we kick all the men out, which doesn't help the agenda either. It's bringing people together. We see women only in the ages of 20 to 40. And we forget that there might be women outside of that boundary and women outside of childbearing. I'm not a childbearer, so that also is complicated for me as well. We just see women as a very specific, narrow mind. And we also forget sexual and gender minorities as well. So super narrow, perspective around how we think about this. But I will say, with different funding windows and different things that have happened in the last kind of 5-6 years, we have seen another kind of real interface between gender and WASH, similar to what we saw in the early 1980s. And I think the more minds that are exploring these trends, the more people thinking about them, the more of us coming together from different sectors. I think gender people and WASH people speak different languages. We just have very different ways of explaining the world and thinking how we describe a flourishing world or what a good world would look like. And so it takes people kind of bridging these two different spaces to help us think through how we might go from being a gender sensitive approach potentially, as Vanya discussed briefly, which is acknowledging that gender actually exists as a concept in our water and sanitation programs, towards maybe gender responsive, which is maybe considering those dynamics. How can we maybe address those or think about them, to maybe more of that transformative, where we're actually seeing WASH as an entry point to shape communities in a more equal way, but then also that equality then also shapes water and sanitation programming. And you get this fantastic synergy of these two pieces of gender equality, social inclusion, and WASH kind of supporting one another and building one another up. So that was a bit long-winded, but hopefully getting a little bit to what you were talking about, Katrina. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jess. And I think I am conscious of time, so there's so much rich discussion to have here. But I want to move to Jenny now. So Jenny, in your current role in CEDA, as a donor, you have some control over this, we like to think. How do you ensure empowerment and gender inclusive approaches are being promoted in the sector?
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you doing all of this amazing research and providing us with these very, very interesting findings. At CEDA, as with so many other donors, of course, gender equality is one of the perspectives that inform our understanding of poverty, which is, of course, what drives donor development cooperation agency. Conflict sensitivity, climate and environment are other of those perspectives that we take into account in all our decisions on granting support. And of course, women's economic empowerment, is another aspect of this that has come in more recently. And this forms our decisions in our programming, but we do the implementation via our partners, such as UNICEF. And we do, of course, rely on evidence-based working papers, briefs, etc., that we base our understanding on. And research such as this can inform how we make decisions, how we understand poverty, women's roles, men's roles, etc. But it is a slow path. For sure. I also wanted to add that all of what has been said today, it aligns very well with CEDA's multidimensional poverty analysis, who has or who lacks resources, opportunities, voice, etc., etc. So yeah, it sits well with what we have, and we're also, of course, always welcoming more insights like what we have heard about today.
Thank you, Jenny. Kitka, if I can turn to you now. I mean, I think there's a lot of talk in the sector about systems strengthening at the moment being, as a key priority. So in your work with governments working to strengthen the WASH systems to improve delivery and sustainability of services, how do you promote these needs around gender and empowerment?
Thank you so much, Katrina, and thank you to the presenters as well. I think at the center of all of this is the leave no one behind principle, and making sure that we really reach out to everyone, everywhere with this service. And when we talk about systems, yes, we will use terms as the enabling environment, the policy environment, regulation, and all of that. But critical to all of these are the people behind it. How accountable are people that are responsible for these services are? And I think this is where then we need to see capacity development, awareness raising, the ability to communicate and engage is critical. And this will then translate all of these systems to deliver services that are sustainable, services that are affordable. I think as a basis for all of these issues is the vulnerabilities that are in different categories, be it physical, be it economic, be it health. how are we aware of these vulnerabilities? And how are we as a group, how are we as those charged with responsibilities for service delivery able to target these levels of vulnerabilities? And I think if we are able to do that, then we would, as looking at a bigger picture, be able to now target and reach out to those that are most in need of this service and are able to access it continually. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kitka. We are going to run out of time, so I will invite our panel to give effectively a final reflections, but that's partly linking into then what does this mean at program level. So if we can keep these quite brief, I think one of the key takeaways for us is certainly that it's very difficult to do. Like, it's really important to understand the empowerment and how intra-household dynamics affect the outcomes. And that can be something that's very hard in the sector to think about how you deliver that. One of the things people can do is make sure they're not bringing their own gender assumptions into some of these discussions and make sure they're communicating to both men and women separately. I mean, that's certainly one of our takeaways from it. But if I can go to each of you in turn, just really briefly. Jess, I'm going to come to you first. I've already put wash gem in the chat, but if you want to flag that, please do.
Yeah,
so 1 minute each.
Yeah, thank you. I think research can be, as discussed a little bit in the chat, can be an entry point also to help shift and change kind of gender dynamics in communities. So thinking also about the process and the action of research as being an opportunity to catalyze change in communities as well. Talking to people about decision making is important. There we
go. Jenny, can I come to you next?
Yes. Well, as I alluded to before, implementation can be a very slow path. And sometimes the end goal is also a moving target, and especially with the uncertainties that we see with climate change, that we have uncertainties and unpredictable situations and extreme weather and so on. And for a donor, we operationalize via our partners, and sometimes that entails much deeper dialogues and understandings among partners who are on board already, whereas others need more nudging and pushing, and we need to ask for special reporting on gender equality, for instance. And that is what we can do to ensure that, we take those things into account.
And I think you were saying in our earlier discussions that it's important to think about particular segments of the sector in like self-supply. How do we make sure we're in dialogue with those different parts of the sector to help share these messages?
Yeah, the self-supply, you can call it a small community of researchers and practitioners who are really understanding that women are sourcing water from various different places because utilities aren't supplying sufficient water timely, etc., etc. And that this has been described today very well. And from a self-supply perspective, the quality, safety, and human behavior dimensions are very important to understand and take into account as well.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Kitka, can I come to you for final reflections?
Yeah, I really want to borrow from the presentation we had earlier, where we talked about focusing on service delivery and not on product delivery. And I think related to that is also the issue of our behaviors as providers of these services. And so we need to keep the dialogue and the engagement between whatever constituencies we are in, and not just see ourselves as one silo, but to link up and continuously see how to improve whatever we are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Kitka. Vanya, I'll come to you last. I mean, I think that, we know from other sectors like nutrition sector that certainly that communication to men and women does get better outcomes from for child nutrition. And so we've seen some positive things, but we also know, you've seen that in some cases there's sensitivities around this. Could you share your final remarks? Thanks.
So thanks, Katrina. I just wanted to, reflect on the fact that engaging men and boys is an important and has been successful in many cases in supporting women's empowerment and other outcomes. But those interventions have to be grounded in the local context, as many of the presenters already pointed out, because changing norms can lead to backlash, including gender-based violence. So it is important to work with gender experts on the ground. And I wanted to just very quickly note that despite advancement in gender data and research, significant data gaps still remain, including around intra-household bargaining power, water, women's participation in water use organizations, and so forth. So I wanted to highlight again and just link to the presentation that developing strategies to close gender gaps and tackle structural causes of inequalities in agri-food system require investing in high quality research and data that is disaggregated by sex, age, and other dimensions of socio-economic differentiation. So we need more of the projects that we saw presented today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's so important that we have that breakdown so we can understand those intersectional differences and how they are reinforcing some of those water security challenges. With that, we are at 9 o'clock. So thank you very much, everyone. There is more information on the websites and LinkedIn, and we can share that in the chat as well. So thank you very much, everyone. And yeah, have a lovely day. Do reach out to a few of us are here at Stockholm. So if you are around, do come and find us, and we'd love to chat about this with you further. Thanks very much.